Welcome. Today our story takes place in rural Arizona in 1975. This story has many witnesses, with one individual who has been interviewed many times over the last 50 years. His story has never changed. This is the story of the fire in the sky. On November 5th, 1975, in the quiet religious town of Snowflake, Arizona, Travis and his 6 logger buddies make their way up to the forest of Sitgreaves National Park. Being 22 at the time, Travis was young and bold, and felt like the world was his oyster. But back in town, he was seen as kind of a rebel to the townsfolk, but he fit in well with his generation. Disembarking the truck, the 7 men set off for their day's work. Each man had a different personality to the last, but each of them got along well and had banter. Travis had a particular disagreement with a man named Dallas, but both remained amicable best they could. The national park was remote. It had taken them a couple of hours to reach their work destination, and they would spend all day working until the sun went down. Nothing was up there except hunters and loggers' trails. It was like travelling back to a wilderness long forgotten by the rest of the world. A place for solitude and the lonely wanderlust. Behind on their contract, and to make up for time they did not have, they would spend every sunlit minute in the forests, only leaving once it became too dark and unsafe to work. After finishing up for the day, exhausted, the men pack up and begin the drive back to town. A few miles down the road, and one by one, the men begin noticing a light peeking through the trees. The light was violent and forever changing, but it did not cause the men any concern. They thought little of it and assumed it to be hunters setting up for the night. However, as they appeared to be getting closer, the light seemed too powerful to be in such a remote part of the world. These 7 men were no novices to the outdoors, and had spent a considerable time over many years up in those forests. But this was something none of them could explain. Opening upon a clearing, with the luminescence visible to their right, they can now clearly see the cause. Across the weeds and brush, approximately 100 feet away, a large metal object loomed menacingly. It hovered there perfectly still. Each man had their own explanation as to what it was, some saying it was beautiful and awe-striking, whilst others were terrified or excited. It was terrifying, yet magnificent at the same time, never moving, but emitting a low hum that was ever present. Travis, as if tranced by a siren's song, gets out of the truck. A wave of curiosity had grown over him as he steps towards the craft. He was enthralled by the beauty of it. But every step he took, he assumed would cause the machine to depart. But no. Ever present it remained. His heart was pounding, almost deafening, blocking out all other noises. Crossing the 50-foot threshold, Travis takes a glance behind. He had been so preoccupied he had failed to hear the screams and some begs for him to return to the truck. His friends had decided it was time to go, but unfortunately for them, with an unwelcome confirmatory nod, Travis resumed his march. Getting closer now, he could see it more clearly. Parts of the craft were made of glass, and it was a saucer in shape and design. The background hum had now raised in volume, becoming an all-encompassing thunder. Travis, expecting something to happen, ducks behind a log, and when he stands once more, he realizes the machine is no more than 10 feet away. A green light fires from the craft, launching Travis through the air. Panic erupted in the truck. No man could decide a clear course of action, but deciding enough was enough. The driver puts the truck into gear and ferociously drives away. He felt shame leaving his friend behind, but faced with such an inconceivable scenario, he just hoped he wouldn't meet the same fate. The atmosphere in the truck exploded. No one could think straight, and everyone exclaimed something different had happened to Travis. Some assumed Travis to be dead, whilst others wanted to go back and recover him. But overarching this, there was a joint worry the craft would follow them, and they'd all be next. Heartbreaking to one side, as far away as they felt safe to do so, the men paused to collect themselves. The light had gone, the hum was no more, and the craft was out of sight. When they finally settle down, the winning consensus decides they must backtrack and locate Travis. Nervously turning around, the truck re-emerges on the clearing once more. What had recently been an illuminated horrorscape was now just an empty field. Pulling courage, they get out and attempt to locate their friend. They searched the immediate vicinity and shouted through the trees, hoping he was nearby. But the forest remained silent. They had failed to find him. They went back to the truck, upset and ashamed. The drive back to town was quiet and tense. No one knew what to do going forward. But how could they just return without Travis and have no logical explanation to tell his loved ones? After a small debate, they decide, even though they won't be believed, they need to phone the sheriff and get help. When the sheriff pulls up to hear their testimonies firsthand, he ignores the UFO evidence and focuses on the missing person in the forest. He wasn't sure if he was being pranked or frauded, but he knew he had to explore all options. And he took the men's words very seriously. He recalls later that the men looked genuinely scared. The sheriff checks their vehicle for drugs and alcohol, but finds nothing of the sort. So, with nothing more to do and a man missing in the wilderness, he calls in a search team and begins preparations to depart by morning. At the crack of dawn, the search begins. In his head, the sheriff believed Travis's friends were covering up a crime, and soon enough one of them would tell him the truth of the matter. But either way, at present, there was work to be done, whatever the truth may be. A large search party, including Travis's colleagues, goes searching, most expecting to find a body. The weather was cold enough that an unprepared night could lead to death from exposure. Professional and fully aware of this fact, the sheriff wastes no time. One of Travis's colleagues, Mike, noticed an unfamiliar group of men with strange instruments nearby. Beckoning the rest of his colleagues to follow him, Mike approaches the suspicious group. When asked, the men say they are using Geiger counters to check for radiation. Confused at how such tech had arrived so quickly, Mike asks for further information, only for the men to be dismissive and claim they had had no hits on their counters. Mike has the idea to ask them to use the counters on him and his colleagues, and reluctantly the men agree, but this amounts to nothing, as they all turn out clean. However, one man points out that they had changed clothes since the previous night. So, bringing a helmet worn the previous day, they ask one final time to take a reading. the counter activates. With this, the men and their instruments leave the scene before Mike or anyone else can get any solid information. These men were never seen again. By the time of the second day, the sheriff had managed to coordinate a helicopter to assist as the search area became larger. They began searching all the barns and buildings in a now 20-mile radius. With all these resources and the bizarreness of the loggers' testimonies, the media begins picking up the story. The sheriff was forever prodding Travis's colleagues for information, assuming still that one of them will crack and reveal perhaps man-made error had led Travis to his disappearance. The sheriff was at a stage where he was still confident they'd find him, but beginning to get frustrated. He did not believe Travis's colleagues. Luckily for the sheriff, the area was commoned by hunters at this time of year. And if there was a body out there or a lost man, then his sniffer dogs or a hunter would find him sooner or later. He believed Travis's colleagues to be stalling whilst they could come up with a plan for how they'd cover up a crime, a view also felt at home by many of the town's residents. But unfortunately for everyone, with the rainy second day coming to a close, and still nothing found, no evidence of crime or UFO, the townsfolk begin to grow resentful towards Travis's colleagues. 3 full days had now elapsed since Travis was reported missing, and at this point the news had gone worldwide. The sheriff was battling camera crews and info seekers on a near constant basis, hindering his work. But ever still, nothing was found. The townsfolk, now more unfrivolous in their beliefs that Travis's colleagues had done something nefarious, demand answers. Knowing he's running out of time, the sheriff calls in some aid in the form of a polygraph specialist. He needs to get to the bottom of what really happened that fateful night, so he asks Travis's colleagues to take a polygraph test. He is sick of wasting his time in what he thinks is a search for a perceived ghost. When he suggested the polygraph, the group were hesitant at first, but all men eventually agree to the test, if anything to clear their own anxieties and their names. Not much time later, waiting in the town's courtroom, with an atmosphere increasingly tense and news crews stirring outside, the group was faced with a situation none could ever have thought they'd ever be in. A man named Cy Gilson walks into the room. He was at that time the best polygraph specialist in the state of Arizona. One by one, he takes the men and interviews them. But with a vast majority of questioning being specified towards a murder investigation, and only a few towards the UFO story, this enraged Dallas. He was the man forcing amicable relations with Travis before his disappearance, and felt with the questioning he was being set up. He refuses to finish the polygraph. When Cy finished all his interviews, he debriefed the sheriff with what he had found. He stated that he would need a second opinion to confirm, but from as far as he could professionally tell, all men were telling the truth. With perhaps chilling last words before he departs, he says, "I don't know what they saw out there, but they definitely saw something." Waking up on the edge of a highway, a fuzzy light shining from above, Travis regains consciousness. The light fires into the sky, leaving him in moonlit darkness. Coming to his senses, but dazed, he starts running down the road. He recognizes the lights in the distance and is relieved to see the town. Energized by a feeling of freedom, he picks up speed and then collapses by a payphone on the side of the road. With a final batch of strength, he calls his brother-in-law and awaits for rescue. When his brother arrives, without hesitation, he loads Travis into his truck and drives him to Phoenix Hospital. Travis, still dazed and caught off guard by his brother's concern, tries to relax. He couldn't piece together an appropriate answer to his brother's questions. Overwhelmed, he broke down and was unable to articulate anything of meaning. His brother had told him he'd been missing for 5 days, but to Travis, he felt he had been gone barely a few hours. At the hospital, doctors run tests and checks on his vitals. They found very little out of the ordinary, but do concur he had been through something traumatic in a recent time. The only evidence on Travis, despite cuts and bruises, was a so-called injection site located on his arm. After feeling it safe to do so, the hospital dismissed Travis, and he returns to his brother's home for the night. Travis's brother had informed the sheriff, and by the time of the next morning, he was at their door waiting to interview. Travis was visibly tired, drained, and tense. He tried to explain what had happened to him, but struggled. Nothing he said made much sense. So, after exhausting all interview options, the sheriff leaves, still not understanding, but relieved Travis was unharmed and back. This case would never fully be resolved in the sheriff's mind, and even to this day, he still believes one of Travis's colleagues did something to him in the woods. A few days go by, and still unsure how to articulate his experience, and finding himself full of fear every time he tried, an offer presented himself to Travis. The offer from the National Flyer proposes funding experiments on him for rights to an exclusive interview. Wanting answers and a return to normality, he agrees. Amongst the tests being conducted, Travis was subjected to an interview under hypnosis. This is what Travis claimed happened to him after his colleagues abandoned him in the woods. Overpowered by pain, and in a hot, humid environment, Travis begins to wake up. He was on a raised surface and struggling to breathe, trying to find the source of the pain. The whole experience flowed like a bad dream, but this was no dream, and there would be no wake-up call or alarm to relieve him. Blurred bodies moved all around him, and unable to focus on the shadows taunting his vision, he could no longer remain still. Jolting his head around, his eyes land on his chest, where some kind of curved apparatus lay crushing down. At first, he assumed he was in a hospital and felt reassured that doctors were working on him after a traumatic experience. However, as if jolted to life once more by an electrical surge, his vision abruptly returned. This was no hospital. All around him were 4-foot-tall greys. Humanoid entities with large, unemotional eyes. The beings stared Travis down, unfaltering in their lack of empathy and hollow expressions. Snapped to his senses and resolved to free himself, Travis lashes out in all directions. In the ensuing pandemonium, Travis dislodges the apparatus on his chest, and liquid expunges from it. He screams for the Greys to leave him be, but they begin walking toward him. With another scream, and finding himself free enough from the equipment to move, he jumps down and runs toward a wall on his right. When turning back, he sees the Greys run through a door far on the opposite side of the room. He was relieved, but now alone in an unfamiliar place. The Greys' ominous presence still remained, and with no visual connection, Travis still felt their presence. Thinking to himself, before the Greys' eventual return, Travis starts running. He arrives at a room with a chair facing away from him. Cautiously peering round, one step at a time, he is thankful to reveal the chair unoccupied. Looking around the room, he sees what he presumes to be a door and attempts to open it. But seeing nothing of importance to indicate a handle, and the metal defiant in will to unlock, he gives up and approaches the central chair instead. As he moves closer to the middle of the room gets darker, and small lights sparkle all around. He pulls a lever on the side of the chair, which illuminates the room in constellations. The sight was beautiful. Stars shone all around, bewitching him as he forgets for a second the horror that has truly befallen him. As his disorientating glance about the room continues, his focus is drawn back to the metal door he failed to unlock. He spots a man waiting for him. His presence felt warm and welcoming, and illuminated by the brightness of a larger open room other side. But the man felt wrong. There was something off with his eyes. Speaking out, Travis asks him what he wants, but the man blanks him and turns, beckoning Travis to follow him. Stepping out the door and down a ramp, a sight of true magnificence encumbers Travis. Saucer-like ships and the scale of the room brought Travis to emotional melancholy. Like a crescendo of the most epic song, the sight witnessed was the true definition of majesty. Lumbering down a corridor, as the sight behind him harshly closed, Travis wandered into the embrace of 3 other humans. They restrained Travis and forced a mask over his face. With his waning strength, as he attempts to resist, the world fades to black. Awoken from his hypnosis, the room was silent. No one could believe the story Travis had just told. But to Travis, this was no story, it was fact. And the seriousness of his words and the tremble of unspoken fear in his reading dislodged any doubt of falsehood the interviewers held. It was a while before Travis met up with his colleagues again, and when he did, they could all tell this was not the same man they had left in the forest. When he tells the men firsthand what he experienced, no man could doubt it. They had also found that others in the area had come forth and claimed they had seen a UFO around the same time Travis was abducted. Most notably, some reports came from a hunter and a separate fisherman who were both in the area that same night. After Travis had told his story in many interviews, he too agreed to be lie detected, and he passed just as all the other men had. Also, years later in the 90s, Dallas, who had originally walked out of his polygraph, passed another. This is a very compelling story, and I personally find no reason to doubt. And combined with the overwhelming evidence from lie detectors and testimonies, it seems truly hard to disprove. The story from all those involved has not changed in 50 years of interviews. But the scene that persuaded me the most was an interview with one of Travis's friends, who is either an incredibly convincing actor or was truly traumatized by the event. In the interview, the man, now in his later years, is still haunted by this experience and breaks down, visibly shook, whilst mentally revisiting the event. I do, however, have two things that personally for me activate my skepticism. And that is that Travis and his family had their own predisposition to UFO stories prior to the event. And when combined with the timeline of a recent film portraying a strikingly similar event, I can understand why some may call him a liar. Also, since this event, Travis has allegedly seen many other UFOs, and some even before this event, he claims. I personally think he appears to be leaning into it, as he apparently sees UFOs on a near frequent basis. Also, do remember, a large portion of Travis's story was formed under the guise of hypnosis, which opens up its own can of worms depending on which camp you align yourself to. Whether hypnosis can create a viably accurate testimony or is just someone's imagination is still contested. But what do you think happened? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you like this content and want to see more, then please check out my other videos and subscribe to my channel. It is deeply appreciated. I hope to see you all next time.